The blood was the first thing that was wrong, and blood is not, by itself, a thing that stops me. I have spent my life in blood, skinning, gutting the small red economy of the trapline. What stopped me was that it ran the wrong way. Uphill. I want to say that plainer, because it took me a long moment there in the storm to understand it myself. I was following my own line down from the high sets, snowshoes squeaking on that dry, cold snow that squeaks like a boot on a church floor, and I came across a track of blood spots leading up the ridge. Not the drag of a wounded deer heading down to the water and the low country the way a wounded thing always goes. This went up, toward the wind. Toward nothing but stone and weather, and the tree line thinning out into that white nothing where a man freezes standing. Only a person goes up in a storm. Only a person with something behind them worse than the storm. I stood there a while. I will be honest with you the way I was not honest with myself. I thought about turning around. I had a fire waiting and coffee, and I was not a young man even then, and the light was going the color of a bruise. Nobody up here would have known if Amos Kettle went home and warmed his feet and let the mountain do what mountains do to fools who climb the wrong way. I told Judith about it. Judith's my mule. She was down at the cabin, warm and unbothered, so I told the storm instead, which is a habit I have. I talk to whatever's nearest, and if nothing's near I talk to the weather, and I'll name a storm the way other men name a horse. This one I'd been calling Leadbitter after a man I once knew who arrived slow and stayed too long and took more than he gave. "Leadbitter," I said, "somebody's dyeing up your skirts." And Leadbitter said nothing, the way weather does, and I went up. I went up because a man can decide the world can freeze without him for 10 years and still, when the moment comes, find that he was lying the whole time. I found her in the lee of a fallen pine, folded down into the roots of it the way an animal dens up to die. Not dying, though. I want that clear. She had made a decision that was the opposite of dying. She had climbed into the worst place in the world and made herself small and still and waited. Because being found by the mountain was a better bet than being found by whatever she'd come up the hill to get away from. She saw me before I saw her. When I finally made out her shape in that blue-white dark, her eyes were already on me, wide open, black, steady, not afraid, measuring. She had a knife, a little worn thing, the handle wrapped in rawhide gone dark with grease and use, and she had it low against her side, out of the wind, ready, not raised, ready. There is a great difference, and I have learned to read it, and reading it that night was the first of the many small mercies she did me, though I didn't know to call it that yet. She was Apache. I knew that the way you know weather, the cut of her, the moccasins, the deerskin gone stiff with cold, the 2 thin lines of some old paint or dye at her hairline nearly worn away. Chiricahua, I'd have guessed, though I'm no scholar and won't pretend the guess was more than a guess. This was hard country and hard years, the years when the army was doing its slow, terrible arithmetic through these mountains, and an Apache alone in the high snow in that season was a person the whole world had decided to be finished with. I knew that, too. I knew it, and my stomach knew it before my head did. The blood was hers. A gash along the outside of her thigh, wrapped already with a strip of something, but the strip had failed and the cold had only slowed the bleeding, not stopped it. She'd been walking on it, up, for a long time. I don't remember deciding. That's the God's truth of it. I remember I was standing there arguing with myself, the sensible half of me lining up all the reasons. The army paid for this kind of thing, and other men would kill me for the other thing, for helping, and I had no medicine and no wife anymore to do the tending, and she'd likely gut me the moment I turned my back. And then I remember I was already down on my knees in the snow with my mittens off, and my hands were doing the work my head hadn't approved. She let me. That was the second mercy. She could have put that knife in my neck. I was close. I was stupid close. I had my head down over her leg, and instead she watched, and when I looked up once, our faces a foot apart, our breath making one cloud between us, she said something. Low. In her own language. I didn't understand a word of it, and I never did learn what those particular words were. But I understood the sound of it. You've heard it. Everybody's heard it once if they've lived. It was the sound a person makes when they are past the end of themselves and something in them still, against all sense, decides to trust. It is not a soft sound. It is the hardest sound there is because it costs the most. All right, I said, it's what I say, to Judith, to the storm, to the fire when it won't catch. All right. All right now. Getting her down that mountain in the dark is a thing I could tell you about for an hour, and it would all be true, and none of it would matter to this story except this. She never made a sound. Not when I got her up over my shoulders, and I am not a gentle load-bearer. I've got the grace of a man carrying stove wood, not when the leg dragged. Not when I slipped on the shale under the snow and we both went down hard and I heard my own knee say something unforgivable. Nothing. She held that silence the way a man holds his breath underwater, like it was the last air she had, and she meant to make it to the far bank on it. I have known proud men. I have known men who die before they'd holler. But there is a kind of silence that isn't pride, and hers wasn't. Pride is loud on the inside. Hers was just economy. She had a certain amount of strength left, and she was not going to spend one flake of it on sound, because sound doesn't warm you and doesn't carry you and doesn't do one useful thing but tell the world where you are. And the world, for her, was a thing to be hidden from. By the time we reached the cabin, Leadbitter had turned mean. The wind came around the corner of the cabin like it had a grudge, and the last 100 yards I walked half-blind with her weight and my ruined knee, and the snow driving sideways into the one eye I could keep open. Judith brayed when she smelled us coming, a warning, then a question. I got the door open with my shoulder, and we fell through it together into the dark and the wood smoke and the sudden blessed still air. And I lay there on my own floor a moment with a stranger across my chest, both of us breathing like bellows, and I thought a thought I hadn't thought in years. I thought, I am not alone in this room. It's a small thought, but I want you to understand what my life had become, that it landed on me like a rockfall. I got a fire up and I got her onto the low bunk by the stove, my bunk, the only one, and I'd sleep on the floor by the door those weeks and think nothing of it. In the light, I could see her better, and what I saw made the sensible half of me go quiet for good. She was younger than the mountain had made her look. And she was tired in a way that goes past the body. I've seen it in animals that have run too long, and I saw it in men after the war, that particular emptied-out stare of a creature that has spent everything it has, more than once, on staying alive, and has begun to wonder why it bothers. The leg needed cleaning and closing. I had a needle I used on harness and a bit of wax thread, and I had whiskey I kept for cold nights and for wounds, and I'd about run out of cold nights I could stomach sober. I showed her the bottle. I showed her the needle. I did it slow, so she'd know what was coming, because a thing done to you is a violence, but a thing shown to you first is a kind of asking. She looked at the needle, she looked at me. And then, and I swear this to you, she took the whiskey out of my hand, and she didn't drink it. She poured it on the wound herself. Her whole body locked up around the pain of it, and her jaw went white at the corners, and still, no sound. Then she handed the bottle back and lay back and turned her face to the log wall and gave me the leg like it was a thing she'd set down and walked away from, and she waited for me to do the rest. I have thought about that night for 50 years, and I have never gotten to the bottom of it. She was telling me something in the only grammar we shared, which was the grammar of doing. She was saying, I will not be worked on. I will not be a thing that happens. Whatever is done to me, I will have my hand in it. She poured the whiskey so that the hurt would be one she chose. Do you see? Even that, even ruined and freezing and hunted off the edge of the earth, she found the 1 inch of the situation that was still hers, and she stood on it. I stitched her up. 11 stitches. I remember because I counted them the way I count everything. I'll tell you about the counting, it's a foolishness of mine. And because 11 would come to be a number between us, though neither of us knew it then. My hands were steadier than they'd been in years. There's a mercy in having a hard thing to do well. It empties out all the rest. When I finished, I sat back on my heels and I was suddenly shaking. All of me, the cold and the fear and the long carry and the strangeness of another living face in my house all coming due at once. And she turned her head and looked at me, this hunted woman half dead, on a stranger's bunk in a stranger's country, and she saw me shaking. And something moved across her face, not a smile. She wasn't a woman who spent smiles on strangers, and she was right not to, but something. A softening at the eyes, the smallest loosening, the way ice will let go its grip on a stone with a sound, so quiet you feel it more than hear it. And she spoke to me, in English, the first of her few words. You, she said, then a long pause, her mouth working around the shape of a foreign thing. You did not run. That was all, 3 words that mattered on the back of a small one. You did not run. She said it like a fact she was writing down. Like she was keeping her own reckoning, the way I keep mine, and she had just entered me into it under a heading I hadn't earned and wasn't sure I wanted. I didn't know what to say. I'm a man who talks to mules and I had nothing, so I did what I do. I got up and I put the coffee on and I said, "You'll want to eat," to the coffee pot, and behind me I heard the smallest sound, the first small sound she'd made, and it took me a second to know it for what it was. She was laughing at me, weak and short and mostly breath, but laughing at the fool talking to his coffee pot. I have been called many things by many people. That laugh is the best review I ever got. I should tell you about the counting, because it's the shape of who I was, and you can't understand what she changed if you don't know what there was to change. I count, I always have. When my head gets loud, and after the war after Sarah, my head got loud in a way I won't describe to you because describing it makes it come back. The counting is the thing that quiets it. I count the notches on the stove door. I count Judith's steps to the creek, 140 in summer, 152 in deep snow. I count the shingles, the traps, the days. I keep an almanac, a little book, but it isn't a proper ledger of stores and skins the way a sensible trapper keeps. I tried that, and it bored me toward the grave. Mine is a book of counts and names, the storms and what I named them, the number of ravens on the ridge on a given morning. The days since I'd spoken to another human being, that number had gotten up past a year once, and when I wrote it down I remember the pen shook and I told myself it was the cold. I show you this because I want you to know I had made myself into an accountant of nothing. I had turned my grief into arithmetic because arithmetic can't hurt you, it just adds up. A man can hide inside a number for a long time. I hid inside mine for the better part of a decade. And then there was a person on my bunk, and my counting had a new column in it, and I didn't have the sense yet to be afraid of what that meant. That first night I lay by the door, and I listened to her breathe. I listened to make sure it kept happening. I'd forgotten there was a whole world of listening that had nothing to do with waiting for danger, the listening you do over a cradle, over a sickbed, the listening that is just love wearing the clothes of worry. I'd done that listening once in another life over a fever that took my Sarah anyway. I'd sworn I was done with it. And here I was, an old fool on a cold floor, counting a stranger's breath so I'd know she was still with me. 1, 2, the long pause, 3. Toward morning the storm broke and the cold came down clear and enormous, and the stars over the smoke hole were so many and so bright they looked like a mistake. And in that quiet she said the second thing. I'd thought she was asleep. They will come, she said, to the ceiling. To the stars, maybe, not to me exactly, but for me to hear. You should think, a pause while she found the rest of it, about what you will say. I understood her. Someone was hunting her, and the hunt would come to my door, and I had better decide now, while it was easy, what kind of man I was going to be when it was hard. I lay there and I did not answer, and she did not ask again. She'd said her piece. She'd given me the warning, plain and fair, and she'd left the deciding where it belonged, which was with me. She would not argue me into being brave. She would not beg. She'd told me the truth, and now she'd let me sit with it, and if I chose small, she would not be surprised, because the world had taught her not to be surprised by that. But I heard, underneath the warning, the thing she was too proud to say and too honest to hide. She did not want to have climbed the wrong way up a mountain to die for nothing. She had spent her silence and her strength getting here. And now, whether I was worth it, whether she'd trusted the right stranger, was a question only I could answer, and I could feel her waiting on the answer the way you wait on a fever to break. I got up before light. I built the fire. I did not say what I would say when they came, because I didn't know yet, and I've never been a man to promise past my knowledge. But I took my rifle down from the pegs, and I cleaned it. That's my other habit, the one I do when I'm unsettled. I clean the rifle whether it needs it or not, the way some men worry a knife or a knot of beads, and I cleaned it slow and thorough, and I set it back up loaded, which it had not been in a long while. And when I turned around, she was watching me do it, and neither of us said a word, but she'd read the rifle the way she'd read everything else about me, faster and truer than I'd have liked. She knew before I did what I'd decided. That's the thing about her I keep circling back to all these years. She spoke almost nothing. But she was reading the whole time, reading me, reading the weather, reading the space between what a man says and what he'll do. And she had already turned the page on me and found, written there in a hand I couldn't see, the answer I wouldn't say out loud for another 3 days. The coffee boiled over. I swore at it. And behind me, small and dry and worn to almost nothing, she laughed again. She had a name. I want to give it to you the way she gave it to me, which was slow, and only when she decided I'd keep it right. For the first 4 days, she was just she in my head, and in my mouth she was nothing, because I didn't dare. You don't hand a name to a person like a bowl of stew. A name is the most a person has left when everything else is taken, and she'd had nearly everything taken, and I could see her holding what remained close and careful the way you'd carry water in your 2 hands across a whole desert. So I waited. I fed her broth first, then meat when she could take it, and I changed the dressing on her leg, and I let the silence in the cabin be a thing we shared rather than a thing I filled. That was hard for me. I'm a filler of silences. But I learned watching her that my silence had been a coward's silence all those years, a running away, and hers was a different animal entirely. Hers was a made thing, a built thing, a discipline. She had turned quiet into a kind of house she could live in. And slowly, without meaning to, I started to move into it with her. On the fourth day she said, "Datsy." She touched her own chest. "Datsy." I'm sure I mangle it even now on the page, and I mangled it worse then, and she made me say it 3 times until I got it near enough that she stopped wincing, and then she nodded once curt, the way you'd nod at a fence post you'd finally got level. "Amos," I said, and touched my own chest, feeling like 10 kinds of fool. "Amos Kettle." "Kettle," she said, and she looked at the actual kettle on the stove, and then at me, and I understood I would be Kettle to her forever, and that somewhere behind that flat, still face she found it funny, a man named after the thing he talked to, and I decided I'd wear it. I've been called worse and meant worse. That was 5 words she'd spent on me by then, if you're counting, and I was counting. You did not run, they will come, you should think, Datsy, Kettle. I had them in my book already, each one with the date. I didn't write down that I'd started to look forward to them, some things you don't put in the book even when the book is only for you. Here is where I have to tell you the hard part, and I've circled it for 2 parts now the way I circled that blood track in the snow, because part of me still doesn't want to go up the hill toward it. Datsy was not running from the army alone. She was running toward something, and the something was a child. I pieced it together over days, from the few words and the many looks and the way she'd go to the window each dusk, and stand there on her bad leg longer than the leg could stand, staring up the mountain toward the high pass, her whole body a question aimed north. And one evening she turned from the window and she'd spent whatever it cost her to decide to tell me, and she told me in the fewest words a thing that should take 1,000. "My people," she said, "went over." She lifted her hand, laid it flat, tipped it over the mountains, over the border, the long, terrible walk south into the Sierra Madre that some of them made in those years, running from a government that had run out of any other idea. I could not. She touched her leg, the wound. She hadn't gotten it running from soldiers. She'd gotten it days before, a fall, a bad crossing, and the wound had made her slow, and slow was death on that road, and so. I stayed, she said, and then the thing that broke her voice, the only time I ever heard it break. My son went with them. I could not walk. He is small. They could not wait. So he went, and I stayed, and I will. And here the English ran out of her, or the strength did, and she finished in her own language, fierce and low, and I didn't need the words. She had sent her child ahead to live because she could not keep up, and she had stayed behind to die so as not to slow the people carrying him, and now she was healing, and the moment she could walk she was going to go after him, alone, hunted over the mountains into Mexico on a wound not closed, because that was the arithmetic of a mother, and a mother's arithmetic doesn't add up like other men's. It only ever comes to one number, and the number is, I go. I sat with that. I am not too proud to tell you my eyes stung. I'd lost a wife to a fever and thought I'd measured the outer edge of what a man could lose. I hadn't. I'd been an accountant of nothing, and here was a woman who'd been handed the one sum I couldn't imagine surviving, and she'd survived it standing, and she meant to walk into more of it on a leg I'd stitched with harness thread. You can't walk that, I said. Not yet, not on that leg, you'll die on the pass. She looked at me with a patience that had a floor of iron under it. Then I will die going, she said, and not sitting. 5 words plus a few, and they've rung in me for 50 years. Then I will die going and not sitting. I had been sitting for a decade. I had a whole cabin built out of sitting. And this woman, who had lost more in a season than I had in a life, would not sit for one more day than her leg made her. I got up and cleaned the rifle. I didn't have anything to say, but something had come loose in me, some old rusted-shut thing, and I could feel the cold air of the world coming in through the gap. They came on the 9th day. Not the army. I want to be honest, because the truth is worse and smaller. It was 3 men I half knew, men off the low country, the kind that drifted the edges of those years looking to turn other people's desperation into coin. There was bounty money in those days, on Apache the government wanted, and there was worse than bounty money, unofficial money, and there were men who'd ride a long way up a hard mountain for it. They'd cut my sign somewhere below, or Datsy's, or both, and they came up the trace to my door in the flat light of afternoon, with the easy loudness of men who have decided the day is theirs. I met them outside. I'd heard them coming. I hear everything up here, it's what the quiet is for, and I'd had time. I'd had time to help Datsy down into the root cellar under the floor and pull the bunk over the hatch, and time to tell her in the grammar of doing, hands and eyes, stay, quiet, trust. And she'd looked at me a long half-second, weighing whether to hand me that trust again, because she'd handed it to strangers before and buried the cost, and then she'd gone down into the dark under my floor without a sound, and I'd covered her over, and I'd gone out to lie to armed men for a person I'd known 9 days. I want to tell you I was calm. I was not. My heart was going like Judith when the wolves are close. But I have an honest face for a liar. It comes of a lifetime of talking to mules. I think you get used to saying true-sounding things to a creature that can't argue, and I leaned in my own doorway with my rifle down and loose in my hand like a thing I'd forgot I was holding, and I lied. "Ain't seen a soul all winter," I said. "Just me and the mule, and a whole lot of nothing." The one in front, a raw-boned man with a jaw like a spade and a way of never quite looking at you, smiled at that. "That's so." He nodded at the snow around my cabin, at the mess of my own coming and going, the trail up to the traps, the wood I'd hauled. "Powerful lot of tracks for a man and a mule." "I'm a busy nothing," I said. He got down off his horse. He didn't ask to. That's the thing I remember, the way he just decided my ground was his to stand on. The other two stayed mounted, spread out, easy, hands where hands go. And the spade-jawed man walked up close to me, closer than a man walks who means you well, and he looked past me into the dark of the cabin, and he sniffed the air like a dog. "Smells like blood in there," he said. Soft, almost friendly. "And 2 kinds of cook smoke," and he looked down and I followed his eyes and my heart went to water because there in the churned snow by my step was a thing I'd missed, a thing I'd been too busy hiding a person to notice. A single small print. A moccasin, Datsy's from when I'd helped her to the door to look north at dusk. Half melted, half filled, but there. He looked at it a long time. Then he looked at me, and the friendliness went out of his face like heat out of a stone at nightfall, and he said the thing that put the whole rest of my life on one turn of a card. "Old man," he said, "you got about 10 seconds to remember you're a white man before I decide you ain't one anymore. I'm going to tell you what I did, and I am not going to dress it up as courage, because in the moment it did not feel like courage. It felt like the opposite of counting. It felt like a man who has hidden inside a number for 10 years suddenly stepping out of the number into the open air, and the open air is cold and enormous and you can die in it, and you step out anyway because you have finally understood that inside the number was never safe either. It was just quiet. And quiet is not the same as safe. She taught me that. She taught me that lying on my own bunk with her face to the wall, spending no sound, safe as a stone and hunted to the edge of the earth. "Her son's over the mountains," I heard myself say. My voice came out steady and it surprised me. "She stayed behind so the boy could go on ahead, hurt her leg. She'd have died on the pass and she knew it and she came up the wrong way in a blizzard to do it somewhere the crows have her instead of you." I looked at the spade-jawed man and I found, to my own everlasting surprise, that I was not afraid of him anymore. I was something worse than not afraid. I was decided. "She's a mother trying to get to her boy. That's the whole of it. And you rode a long way up my mountain to make money off it. And I'm telling you to get back on your horse and ride down and be a smaller kind of man than you came up here to be. Because the other kind I'll have to bury, and the ground's froze, and I'm too old to dig." For a moment nobody moved. The wind came around the corner of the cabin. Somewhere down the ridge a raven said something rude. I counted in the back of my head without meaning to, 1, 2, the old habit, the last of it, ticking down the seconds of my life. And then the spade-jawed man laughed, and it was an ugly laugh, and he started to bring his rifle up, and I knew with a flat, cold certainty that I was about to die on my own doorstep for a woman I'd known 9 days and a boy I'd never met. And the strangest thing, the thing I've never been able to explain to a living soul, was that it was worth it. That was the thought, clear as a bell in cold air. It's worth it. After 10 years of a life that wasn't worth the wood it was built on, I had found, in the space of 9 days and 11 words, something worth dying on my feet for. And I would rather die on my feet in the open, cold air of it than live one more year hidden inside a number. I brought my own rifle up. And that is where I have to leave you for the space of a breath, because the next thing that happened I did not do. I did not do it. I have to tell it careful, and I have to tell it right, and it's going to take the last part to do it, and I have carried it 50 years, and I have never once told it whole. The root cellar hatch came up. I felt it more than saw it, the bunk behind me shifting, the cold breath of the underfloor, and then Datsy was there in my doorway, upright on that ruined leg, and she had a rifle. My old rifle. The second one, the one I never loaded, that hung in the dark by the cellar hatch. She'd found it down there in the black, and she'd loaded it in the dark by feel in the time it took 3 men to threaten one old fool, and she'd come up out of the ground like something the mountain itself had sent, and she had it leveled, and it did not waver. But she did not fire it. That's the thing, that's the whole thing. Listen. She could have. She had the drop on the spade-jawed man. He'd forgotten there might be more than one gun on that mountain. They always forget. Men like that, they think the whole world is theirs to stand on. She could have put a ball through him before he cleared his own weapon, and it would have been fair. God knows it would have been fair. Fairer than anything that had been done to her people in 10 years of that slow, terrible arithmetic. She had every reason and every right. Instead she spoke 6 words, the last of her few and the ones that changed me, and I will hear them when I die. He is not worth your winter. She said it to me, not to them. To me, the rifle steady on the spade-jawed man, her eyes on me. He is not worth your winter, meaning don't. Meaning, I have watched you these 9 days come back from the dead, Kettle. I have watched some frozen thing in you thaw, and if you kill this man, you will spend the rest of your winters inside that killing. You will build a new number to hide in, and it will be a worse one. And I did not climb the wrong way up your mountain and stitch my life to your kindness only to watch you trade one grave for another. He is not worth your winter. Meaning, let me. I have nothing left to lose that this would cost me. But you have just found something. Don't spend it here, not on him. And the spade-jawed man, looking down the barrel of a rifle held by a woman who had been dead to the world an hour ago, made the calculations such men always make when the price of a thing suddenly comes due. He found that the money wasn't worth dying for after all, that it never is, that the whole ugly trade only works when the other person has no gun and no friend and no ground to stand on. He'd thought she had none of those. He'd been wrong on all 3 counts. They rode down, slow at first, saving face, and then not slow. And I stood in my doorway shaking, and Datsy lowered the rifle, and the strength that had brought her up out of the ground and held that barrel level went out of her all at once, and she sat down hard on my step, her bad leg out straight, and she looked up at me. And for the first time in 9 days her face was fully open, everything on it. All the terror and the grief and the enormous animal exhaustion, and under it, this is the part I can hardly write, under it was something almost like peace. Because she'd guessed right. She'd trusted the right stranger. Twice she'd handed me the thing that cost the most, and twice I hadn't run, and now she knew it, and knowing it was a kind of rest. I sat down beside her on the cold step. I didn't talk to the coffee pot. I didn't count anything. I just sat, and after a while, without either of us deciding it, her shoulder came to rest against my arm, the whole slight weight of her, and we watched 3 small figures dwindle down the white mountain into the low country, and neither of us said one single word. That's the silence I'd been running from my whole life. Turned out it wasn't empty. Turned out it was the fullest thing there is. She'd known that all along. She'd been trying to tell me in the only language we shared, which was the language of not running. She left 11 days later. The leg had closed enough. Not enough, never enough for what she meant to do, but enough for a woman who would die going and not sitting. And I'd learned by then not to argue with her arithmetic, because her arithmetic was the truest thing on that mountain. I gave her Judith. I want that in the record. I gave her my mule, who I'd talked to for a decade, who was the only creature that had heard my voice in all that time, because a mule could carry her where her leg couldn't and might get her over the pass alive. And I found I did not care one particle about the 10 years of talking. She was a tool for keeping Datsy alive, and I'd have given her my own 2 legs if they'd have done the job better. Datsy didn't thank me. She wasn't a woman who spent words she didn't have, and thank you would have been a cheapening of what was between us, and we both knew it. Instead, the morning she left, in the blue dark before light, she stood with Judith's lead in her hand, and she looked at me a long time, taking a reckoning, entering me one last time into whatever book she kept in that still fierce heart. And she spoke to me, in her own language, same as that first night in the snow, words I didn't understand and never learned, low and certain, spent on me deliberately this time, a gift and not a leak. I didn't ask what they meant, some things you don't put in the book. But I have thought all these years that they were her name for me, her true name for me. The one Kettle was only a joke standing in front of, and that she said it out loud once into the cold. So that somewhere in the world there'd be a name for the man I'd turned out to be, even if the only 2 who'd ever hear it were her and the mountain. Then she got up on Judith, careful of the leg, and she went up, toward the pass, toward the wind, toward her boy over the mountains and the whole hunted length of country between. The way only a person goes. The way only a person with something ahead of them worth more than the storm behind them goes. She didn't look back. I wouldn't have wanted her to. Looking back is for people who aren't sure, and Datsy was the surest thing I ever met. I stood in my door and I watched her out of sight, and then passed out of sight, watching the empty place where she'd been the way you watch after a fire's gone out. And I did the thing I do, the last time I ever did it that way, I counted. I counted her words. All of them, all the English ones she'd ever spent on me, laid out in my book in my own bad hand. You did not run, they will come, you should think, Datsy, Kettle. Then I will die going and not sitting, he is not worth your winter. I counted them and it came to more than 11, and I sat down and I laughed and then I wasn't laughing, because I understood that the counting was over. That I'd counted my last thing. That she'd taken the number I'd been hiding in and cracked it open like a nut, and left me standing in the open cold air of an actual life, and there was no going back inside. I never learned if she made it. I've made my peace with that mostly, the way you make peace with a stone in your boot you can't get out, you stop expecting it to leave and you learn to walk on it. There were years I told myself she made it. She got over the pass, she found the boy, they lived down in the Sierra Madre in the free air the way the last of them did for a while. And there were years, the bad ones, when I couldn't tell myself that, when I knew what the odds were on a hunted woman on a stolen mule crossing that country in that season. And I'd lie by my door. I kept sleeping by the door all my life. Some fool part of me listening for a hatch to come up, and I'd count her breaths in my memory, 1, 2, the long pause, 3, and pray the pause never got too long. I came down off the mountain the spring after. Did you guess that? I told you at the start she changed me forever, and you might have thought I meant something soft. I mean, I came down. I went back among people. It near killed me. I was rusty as an old trap. I'd forgotten how, but she'd shown me that being alone up there had never been strength. It had only been a long, quiet hiding, a number I'd crawled inside after Sarah died. And I'd watched a woman who'd lost everything refuse to sit down in her grief for even one extra day, and I couldn't unwatch it. You can't. Once you've seen a person do the bravest thing there is with nothing but a bad leg and 6 words, your own excuses stop fitting you. They hang off you like another man's coat. I married again years on, had a girl, named her well. You can guess what I wanted to name her, and you can guess my wife wouldn't have it, a strange Apache name on a rancher's daughter, and she was right, and I understood. But I'll tell you a thing I never told my wife. Whenever the first snow came down, every winter of my long life, I'd go out on the step alone, and I'd stand in it, and I'd say those 6 words out loud into the cold like a man saying grace. He is not worth your winter. Because I have had a lot of winters, more than my share, and there's been a lot of men and a lot of grudges, and a lot of dark, small numbers I could have crawled back inside, and every time I've stood on my step in the first snow and heard her say it, he is not worth your winter, and I have not spent one single winter of my one life on anything she wouldn't have let me. That's the whole of what she left me. It's more than most men get from a lifetime of talking. She gave it to me in a handful of words, from behind a face that spent nothing it didn't mean, on a mountain at the frozen edge of the world. She spoke only a few words. I've told you every one. They changed the mountain man forever, and the mountain man is old now, and the snow is coming down tonight the way it came down the night I carried her in out of Leadbitter's teeth. And I'm going to go stand on the step, and I'm going to say her 6 words, and then I'm going to say the other thing, the thing I've never said, the thing I've saved 50 years for the last winter, because I think this one's the last winter. And if she's out there over the mountains, over all the mountains, I want the first snow to carry,